This audio file is a collection made of the summaries of selected articles on Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire. The recordings were made by master's degree students of English literature at Alzahra University for the contemporary drama class of spring 2021.
Hello everyone. The article that I read is named Quest for Identity in Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire. It was published in Studies in Literature and Language in 2011 by Hoorvash. Actually, he's Iranian. In the play, the theme of alienation is dramatized by the tragic plight of a saffron widow, Blanche Dubois, who finds it difficult to get the aristocratic glory of the past out of her self-sustained world. With Blanche's experiences with the world, Tennessee Williams has portrayed the process of finding and seeking identity, where she appears to be a misfit. Tennessee Williams has artistically combined psychological and social elements of the quest for self in portraying Blanche's character. The play's action includes Blanche's stay with her sister Stella, who lives in a two-room apartment in New Orleans, with her husband Stanley Kowalski, who is the villain, as we know. While both the sisters, Stella and Blanche, exhibit commonness through their marriages in terms of their escape from paternal authority, they vary and they are different in their choice of life partners and their choices' differential consequences, as we know. Stella selected Stanley based on love, but Blanche selected Alan Gray because of his refined character. And to her shock, she learns that her artistic husband Alan is actually a homosexual. With her brother-in-law Stanley, who perceives her as an intruder into his comfortably settled male-dominated conjugal universe, Blanche is engaged in a subtle power game in the family of her sister. Tennessee Williams' dramatic comment on American life in a larger context is shown in the play. He makes the influence of human instincts evident in the play. It is not a play about emotions and desires that is distinct from the daily reality, which is a normal thing. Instead, it reveals what every American, and even in a wider context, every human being might feel. The identity problem that Blanche faces actually occurs because of the men in her paternal home. In her life, Blanche's dissatisfaction stems from her inability to describe herself in a feminine paradigm. She still seems to be finding a masculine center for her definition of herself, which she finds neither in the family of her father nor in the man she marries. In her intimacy with strangers, there is a remarkable trend that illustrates a quest for oneself through sexuality. And for example, in her sexual partners, Blanche often prefers young men, whether they are army enlistees, high school students, or a paperboy. All are nearly the same age. Her ability to recover the lost past is symbolized by the choice of young men. The loss of her marriage still haunts her. Blanche makes a vain effort to move backwards in time through these young men, to negate her conjugal catastrophe by hoping in her romantic relationships to have a happy ending. It's also interesting to note that the men Blanche is looking for are around the age of her husband at the time that he killed himself. There is more of a nostalgia factor in these encounters than just lust. Blanche has idolized her husband. She was not mature enough to have Alan's homosexuality exposed to her, and the news came as a shock to both her self-esteem and her romantic dreams. The sexual desire of her husband for another man implied to her that she was not beautiful enough to retain her husband's affection. And as we know, she was very young, so it's hard to expect her to grasp the biological and sexual compulsions of homosexuality at her tender age. In Blanche's exploration of herself, the most basic challenge is her temporal fixation. She finds herself fixed in an ideal world of the past that has been lost and can never again be a reality. In contrast to the world around her, Blanche's misfortune is due to her incompatible self. And the author of the article believes that Stanley's abuse of Blanche is not uncommon for Stella, her sister, since she still embraces what might be considered a marital rape without any resistance. There is a violence touch to the lovemaking of these two people, Stella and Stanley. The play's action reveals that a male-dominated universe absorbs both Blanche and Stella. Blanche faces devastation because through her resistance to Stanley, she decides to publicly protest against male tyranny. At the same time, Stella, which is more clever in the writer's eyes, loses herself because in her marital and social life, she has traded her identity for stability. Actually, I'm not in agreement with the writer of this article because this article is itself written from a patriarchal point of view because it says if you don't want to be ruined, you should accept the life as it is, even if you are abused. And Stella did the right thing. And Blanche, who was a misfit, deserved the fate that she had. And I didn't like this part, actually. I wish to talk about this more on tomorrow's session. Thank you.
Hello. The title of the article that I'm going to talk about is Blanche, Stella, Tennessee, and Rose, the sibling relationship in A Streetcar Named Desire. The author is Daniel Jacobs, and the publisher is Routledge, and I have found this article on the Taylor and Francis website, and it was published in the year 2006. Now, Tennessee Williams once said, "The fear of the world, the fight to face it and not run away is the realest thing in all experience for me." And for so long, almost as long as his career spanned, he had been preoccupied with the issue of abandonment and establishing an identity for himself. But his super intense attachment to his older sister Rose was always in the way and hindered him from taking a route of his own because his infatuation with her was so extreme that he could not make out where she ended and he began. Rose was actually his alter ego. He saw himself in her and he tried to follow suit whatever she did, and later she became his muse. This article poses the primary question: how can we trace the ambivalent relationship between Rose and Tennessee in Blanche and Stella's relationship in A Streetcar Named Desire? Now, to answer this question, the writer plunges the depth of Tennessee's area of expertise, namely his playwriting excellence. The writer mentions that a huge chunk of Tennessee's works actually deal with this very theme of abandonment and leaving behind what is sure to be followed with agony and consistent pangs of remorse, guilt, and regret. He does this ever so clearly in his infamous play that we all know, The Glass Menagerie, where he is easily identifiable in the character of Tom Wingfield, who is the brother figure, Laura's brother. It is actually safe to say here that The Glass Menagerie is actually Williams's guilt-ridden justification to himself and others for his departing from his family when they were in the hour of need. The same theme is actually visible in A Streetcar Named Desire, where Stella lets go of her sister just to hold on to that last smidgen of consistency and security that has been threatened on various occasions by the soul's breadwinner and securer of the household, who is her husband, Stanley. We see that Stanley actually fails and ceases to allow Blanche get a taste of happiness by marrying his friend Mitch. Actually, he hinders that marriage. And he mutilates her completely by closing every single door that she knocks on or intends to turn to. And at the end, he rapes her and makes sure that she is on a one-way trip to utter madness. Now, in this play, we can spot a drop of Tennessee in almost every single main character. Like he is Stella, who lets go of her sister just to gain a sense of self, despite her already challenged inner and outer peace. At the same time, he is also Stanley. Actually, he feels like Stanley because he feels like he has wronged Rose by being away when she was sick and was undergoing a frontal lobe surgery while he was pursuing his studies. And the rape scene actually resembles that frontal lobe surgery that took place while he was away. At the same time, he is Blanche, who tries to forget the disturbing past by introducing fiction into reality. So we can see that he is multiple characters. He can be spotted in multiple characters in this play. For Tennessee, writing plays through getting in touch with his creativity was only a brief treatment which bestowed upon him a sense of integrity. And in A Streetcar Named Desire, Tennessee tries to free himself from his identification with Rose and the threat of castration and the loss of self that she represents. The streetcar forever unites him and separates him from his sister, who both helped him maintain his sanity and also pose a threat to it later in his life. Now, where I stand in relation to this article is that I agree with most of the things that Jacobs is saying, because I believe that Tennessee actually has had this tendency to work through his trauma by writing plays that actually encapsulated all of the themes of the events that he had gone through himself in his life. And since everything that was in his life was in one way or another influenced by Rose, we can spot Rose in this plays and in these literary works as well. Now, I don't think that turning her sister into literature was a permanent way of working through his trauma, but I think that it was a temporary one, which slowly but surely helped him maintain his sanity after the pain of guilt that he could not bear. So in a way, I agree with the statements of Jacobs in this article, and at the same time I want to stress the power of working through trauma using literature, which is a very significant and important thing if one ponders upon.
For this week's play, I read the analysis on the patriarchy and commitment of females by Jacqueline O'Connor as it appears in Harold Bloom's Guide to A Streetcar Named Desire, published in 2006. I found the book through a Google Books. I can send it to the group if anyone is interested. Basically, in this article, O'Connor argues that despite being about 19th century women in France, Yannick Ripa's study of women and madness is relevant to the time of the play's publication, and that Blanche's circumstances resemble those described by Ripa. Ripa's study is on single women who had to work to support themselves, but on the occasion that they lost their jobs later in life, they were most likely committed to mental hospitals by their families. She explains how mentally ill spinsters were seen as embarrassments to the family, both because of their financial reliance on the family and the supposed danger they would pose for them. And they were usually committed by nephews or brother-in-laws. O'Connor argues that Blanche's situation at the beginning of the play is just so. She has no job, and her weak nerves come up as early as the second scene. And as it is later revealed, she also has lost her family home where she could have otherwise lived. The two times that Stanley and Stella discuss Blanche's circumstances without her present, both the issue of her mental illness and lack of income are also mentioned. In fact, a major point of contention in the play is Blanche's living arrangements, and when it is become clear that she is in need of permanent lodging and that she cannot return to Laurel or a job she doesn't have anymore, that is when Stanley seriously starts to speculate alternative options for Blanche in the future, and he becomes less tolerant of her presence. Blanche is at the mercy of her relatives, and in light of being jobless, possibly mentally ill, and homeless, she has no option but to do as her family decide for her. O'Connor also mentions other facts as well, such as the symbolism of blue water and Blanche's young love, and how this first love is the source of her mental instabilities. The reason I chose to read this article was because of its themes, which I personally found interesting and sort of noticed when I read the play myself, which was that Blanche had a very delicate position in the household, and a lot of the conflict would not have existed if Blanche wasn't a financial liability. While I think this wasn't the only factor that affected Stanley's negative perception of Blanche, but I thought had she had some sort of financial backing behind herself, some kind of power he would not have been so obliged to mistreat her as he did. But this is not the only character who has this issue. Stella also has some sort of financial anxiety that she has to worry about. The fact that she's willing to stay with Stanley despite the fact that he beats her and might not be the most ideal husband probably comes from that anxiety as well. By the end of the play, Stella is less willing to believe her sister than her husband, and she says that if I believe Blanche, I won't be able to live with Stanley anymore. And it actually makes sense because she will have to face so many difficulties if she were to live on her own. She has no job, she just gave birth to a baby, and she does not have any money or any ancestral home to take refuge at if she leaves her husband. Therefore, I think the conversations about the role of the women in the story and their financial liabilities would be interesting to discuss further in class.
The article that I have read is called Domestic Violence in A Streetcar Named Desire. It's written by Susan Coppens, and it's the third chapter in Harold Bloom's literary interpretations. Domestic violence has been ignored in American society until 1970s, so literary criticism of A Streetcar Named Desire tends to ignore the subject. But if we view the play from a modern perspective, we discover that Stanley is not just a charming man who has occasional outbursts of violence. Rather, he's an abuser, an assaulter, whose aggressive masculinity and desire for control are perfectly consistent with the profile of an abuser. Assaulters and abusers tend to have some characteristics. They are hyper-masculine, they use aggressive behavior as verification of their manliness, they believe in male superiority and view women as sexual objects to be dominated. They resort to both physical and sociological abuse in an effort to control their wives, and they're extremely jealous and possessive, fearful that their wives will ultimately leave them. And finally, they have a dual personality, which means that they show charming and generous characteristics on some occasions, but they're cruel and violent on some other occasions. Since we've all seen the play, we can understand how Stanley can be seen as an abuser or an assaulter because he manifests all the characteristics that I mentioned before. But it's not just that Stanley has characteristics of an abuser. Estella also shows the characteristics of a typical assaulted woman. Such women exhibit a low self-esteem that is usually related to repeated victimization. They hold traditional values about women's roles in the home, and they tend to accept things as they are, believing that they cannot change things. They tend to believe that they have little control over their own lives, and they often cope with their situation through the mechanism of denial. We can see all of these traits and characteristics in Estella. So Estella has characteristics of a typical assaulted or abused woman, and Stanley shows typical characteristics of an abuser. But critics have tended to ignore this kind of chemistry between the two characters. They've mostly focused on Stanley and his masculinity or hypermasculinity, but they have not focused on the relationship between domestic violence and Stanley's hypermasculinity. Also, the rape that happens at the end of the play is not just a brutal act of anger or masculinity. It also ties in with a theme of domestic violence in the play. The act of rape that happens in the play is not just an act of power or anger directed towards Blanche. It can also be considered as an act of domestic violence, because domestic violence isn't always directed at wives. It can also be directed at other family members. And in this case, by committing the act of rape, Stanley isn't just trying to humiliate Blanche. He's also trying to humiliate Estella. He's trying to remove her from her background, her heritage at Belle Reve. So you can see that domestic violence is one of the main themes of the play, but it has been ignored by critics because it was usually ignored in American society at the time where the play was written. And also in the play itself, domestic violence isn't taken very seriously. Estella keeps going back to Stanley and saying that what he's doing is just a way of asserting his masculinity. I mean that Estella keeps dismissing what Stanley is doing. Another instance where domestic violence is ignored in the play can be seen in their neighbors, because they seem to be having a lot of fights, but they reconcile easily and pretty soon. So domestic violence, although it has been manifested in the play, but it's treated as something not serious, something to be dismissed. And the critics have mostly treated it as something not serious as well. But in this article, Susan Koprins believes that domestic violence should be treated as something serious and one of the main themes of the play.
Hi everyone, I am summarizing Desire, Death and Laughter, tragicomic dramaturgy in A Streetcar Named Desire by Verna Foster. This text is included in Bloom's Modern Critical Views, Tennessee Williams, edited by Harold Bloom in 2007. This text is about the tragicomic style of the play and how tragedy and comedy function symbiotically in the play. Tragicomedy is a genre which does not offer its audience a cathartic experience. Rather, what it offers is a more ambiguous and disturbing theatrical experience. The play is mainly about the conflict of Blanche and Stanley, who are both tragicomic characters. From one perspective, Blanche can be seen as a sensitive and tormented woman cast out from her refuge by her crude brother-in-law. From another point of view, a working man is trying to defend his home from this snobbish intruder. Of course, neither of this is completely true. The truth is that Blanche is, quote, too self-indulgent to evoke the kind of emotional identification that an audience typically feels with the suffering of a tragic protagonist, unquote. While Williams brings out sympathy in the audience for the characters, he does not allow complete identification. We usually tend to associate this blocking of empathy with Brechtian theater. One example of this is Blanche's drinking problem. Blanche tries to hide her drinking problem in kind of comical ways, really. However, as we understand, she drinks because she wants to forget her past or to make her current situation with Stanley more bearable, which is quite tragic. This style of tragicomedy really suits what Williams is doing here, which is showing desire and death as identical as well as opposites. For example, Blanche's sexuality seems to be her escape from death, but eventually it leads to her death, at least figuratively. At the end of the play, what is displayed is basically that life must go on. However, the play does not allow its audience to experience tragic catharsis from Blanche's destruction or a comic satisfaction that Stanley and Stella stay together. In fact, if anything, the continuation of Stanley's and Stella's life together is quite appalling. This book chapter ends like this. Quote, desire may be the opposite of death, just as comedy is the opposite of tragedy. But in A Streetcar Named Desire, tragicomedy fuses an emotionally charged and psychologically acute symbiosis between them, unquote.
The article that I studied for this play is called Quest for Identity in Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire by Hoorvash, which is published in a journal named Studies in Literature and Language in 2011. The purpose of this study is to analyze Blanche's life in her parental home at Bereave and her sister's home at New Orleans to show her quest for identity. In the introduction part, this article explains that this play was written during the post-war period, whose generation faced a kind of disillusionment, and the words disillusionment and disillusioned are the words that we can hear several times during the play, especially from Blanche herself. The article says that this play catches the main theme in the contemporary American literature, which is loss of self and also the quest for self or identity. And it also explains that in American drama, generally, there exists a kind of anxiety about the absurdity of contemporary life, and that is why the concept of despair is a recurring theme or form in almost all the dramatical works of American literature. Another contemporary belief that is reflected in the play is that man's personality is determined by his innate or intrinsic dualities. And if these dualities are in conflict with the roles that someone is expected by the society to perform, then that person will suffer. And this suffering is the source of the quest for knowledge and identity. What we see is that these themes are dramatized through the life of a southern widow named Blanche de Bois in this story, who can't get out of her world of the aristocratic glory of the past, and the whole play somehow revolves around Blanche's efforts to adjust herself to her surroundings. This article mainly focuses on 2 points in the character of Blanche. One is her personal life and her relation to her identity, and 2 is her sexual relationships with men and what these relationships actually symbolize. In the part about her personal life, the article covers some pieces of information about the background of Blanche's life, and it explains that her home in Bellerive is actually a patriarchal home, which is lost by the male members of the family. And we see that Blanche's identity crisis actually began in her parental home when the male members of her family sold Bellerive and she was left alone, and first she tried to fight the decay and death and loss of her parental home, but eventually she gives into the pressure and escapes to live with her sister in her home. It can also be perceived that the patriarchal atmosphere of Bellerive and its aristocratic features and notions drive both sisters to escape their home through marriage, while there's of course a kind of difference between the two sisters in this regard, because Stella's choice of Stanley is based on passion only and it is somehow free in nature, but Blanche's choice of Alan Gray is actually based on her preference for delicacy and refinement, which actually stems from her aristocratic background, and it shows that she's very much under the influence of her aristocratic background, unlike her sister Stella. Also, the lack of intimacy that she experiences in her family drove her both toward her unsuccessful marriage and her later unrestrained relationships with men. There is also a kind of insecurity in her personality, mainly because of the lack of strong and responsible men in her life, because we saw that male members of her family actually left her alone after the death of their parents, and she lost her parental home because of them. And in her marriage, the homosexuality and suicide of her husband actually heightened this insecurity. In the next part, which is about her sexual relations with men, the article explains that the death of Blanche's husband has a very significant role in her life, because it is after this incident that she seeks to avoid the inevitable fact of human mortality, and for her, desire becomes the antidote to prevent death. And here we see that death represents the power of time, while Blanche's actions are attempts to neutralize this power. So desire for young men is her weapon against death. And her choice of young men for sexual relationships can be the symbol of her desire to somehow retrieve the lost past and death of her husband. So she chooses young men approximately of the age of her husband at the time of his committing suicide, and unlike her past way of treating her husband, which was cruel and harsh, she approaches these men in a kind and sympathetic manner, apparently to lessen the burden of guilt she has, since she believes that she and her behavior is somehow responsible for the death of her husband.
Well, the article that I found on the play A Streetcar Named Desire is an article written by Rachel Kafka, And it basically talks about the fact that Williams explores the impact of mental illness on reality, especially through the character of Blanche. So what it suggests is that Blanche's mental illness raises questions about the person who has the power to construct reality. And not only that, but also the question whether all realities are merely constructions. So we see in the climax of the play where Blanche is moved to a mental hospital, the question comes to mind whether it is the physically and emotionally powerful that define and somehow decide others' reality that they will have to accept. Also, well, another major point is that the play shows a way in which a fantasy world is somehow described as reality and is also substituted by that reality through Blanche's character. You see that she's so traumatized by the events of her past that she creates an alternative reality, a reality based on her past triumphs. However, this reality is just too fragile. And also we see that at some point she says to her suitor that she in fact replaces the truth with what ought to be truth. And you see that this mere sentence says it all. So it's really obvious that she replaces the reality of her situation with what she wishes her life to be, with what she desires her situation to be, and not what it really is the situation. And so this is the main point that this article talks about.
Hello everyone. The title of the article that I chose for this session on the dialectics of trauma in Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire is written by Frederick Koff and Paul Tyndall, and it was published in Springer Science Journal. This article's main argument is that Blanche is not a mad character from the start, but rather she is the victim of a trauma. She witnessed the suicide of her husband, and it is suggested that she is suffering from symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. For instance, involuntarily relieving of the traumatic events. For example, throughout the play, there are some auditory cues, like the polka music. When polka music is played, she becomes anxious, and also her excessive use of alcohol is the result of her self-destructive behavior. Also, her tendency to forget the present moment, and also she tries to deny what has happened in the past. In the article, they propose a term called a culture of denial, and they suggest that the other characters, Stanley, Mitch, and her sister Stella, do not fully recognize her struggle to come to terms with trauma and loss. They propose that the reason that she returns to her sister house is because that she is in search of someone to understand her and to show empathy for her, which we can see that in her relationship with Mitch. But they fail to do that later in the play. According to Judith Herman, trauma dehumanizes the victim, the group restores her humanity. But in the play, we can see that the opposite happens. And eventually, Blanche descends into madness.
The article that I'm going to explain is called Authorizing History: Victimization in A Streetcar Named Desire. It is written by Anka Velaspoulos, and I found it online on JSTOR, but in order to download it, I used Google Scholar. It was originally published in Theater Journal, October 1986. So the author in this article begins by examining the form and the genre of this play, and she argues that you can consider A Streetcar Named Desire as you can consider it to be a tragedy, but unlike classical tragedies that just try to purge the audience out of any emotion and they are kind of didactic. It isn't didactic, it just leaves you in ambivalence and it presents you with a narrative of power and how any shifts in the power dynamics can just rewrite the whole history. So the name of the history as a crucial element is included in the title, and throughout the play the author argues that we have two characters who are competing with each other in order to define the other character and in order to get rid of the other figure of authority. They are Blanche and Stanley, and of course Blanche begins as a character who is out of place, and Stanley is a character who is of a certain sex and a certain class, and his behaviors are acceptable. As a working class man, he loves sex, he loves poker, and he enjoys the company of other men. But unlike him, Blanche is a woman who is neither young nor married, and she has lost her job and has been unable to form a relationship with any man who would be able to provide for her. So she's even loyal to the memory of a homosexual husband. So she's kind of out of place, but despite such queer characteristics of her, she manages to at least momentarily gain the status of the more powerful character in the story. And during several scenes, for example, when she is arguing with Stanley over the documents and the papers and the history of their plantation, she manages to impress him and impress the audience and impress the other characters. But little by little, she loses her authority and she starts to feel unstable, and it is more emphasized when she is kind of losing her grasp on her sister. And Stanley begins to try to rewrite the history by going around and asking other people about Blanche, and he actually discovers some rumors about her that he tells to her sister in order to kind of undermine her presence and her figure. So he even tries to, prove that she is a low woman when he tries to rape her, although she resists and she tries to preserve her dignity. He finally rapes her, and the play ends by other characters and the whole cast ignoring Blanche and just letting her go away, and they just comply with Stanley, and even Stella, her own sister, decides to stay with his own husband, and she refuses to believe the story of Blanche. So in this play, what we actually witness is how the winner gets to write the whole history.